Thank you for joining me today at .NET Conf. I'm very happy to be here, and especially to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is Stack Overflow and how it's made. I'm Roberta. I'm a director of engineering at Stack, and let's get started. So the actual content that I wanted to share with you today is about our migration to .NET 6. And in order to do that and to start telling you about the challenges that we faced and the improvements that we observed from that migration, I need to first talk about how Stack Overflow is built and what technology we use and what is Stack Overflow really. So let me get started by sharing some numbers about Stack Overflow, the product. First of all, I hope if you who are listening to me right now are a developer, that you actually already know Stack Overflow and that you use it on your day-to-day life. But perhaps you do not know that Stack Overflow was launched in 2008. So it's been almost 15 years since we have been live. And those of us who used to be developers before that, I imagine remember very well how hard it was to find solutions to our problems. Currently, Stack Overflow has 23 million questions, give or take, 34 million answers to programming questions, and 19 million registered users. We also get around 60 million unique users per month. So that's 60 million developers or people who just want to learn how to program and solve their problems who visit our sites every single month. But Stack Overflow is actually just one of over 180 Q&A sites that we host. And it's important to say this because all of those sites, including Stack Overflow, are actually powered by the very same application. Stack Overflow is a multi-tenant application that hosts over 180 Q&A sites. And these are some numbers from very fresh numbers, by the way, from October 24th that I collected to show you what that means in terms of how does that get to our application and our infrastructure. So we got on that day around 226 million requests to our load balances. Out of those, 85 million-ish were page views. And we sent over 4 terabytes of data across those requests. And we ran 700 million SQL queries from HTTP requests alone. In fact, we actually ran over 1 billion SQL queries that day, including all of our servers. We also had almost 300 million Redis hits. Redis is one of the infrastructure pieces that we use for caching. And we did all of that. We took all that traffic. We served all of those requests with an average render time of 24 milliseconds for our hottest path, which is the question page, right? The one that you all know when you Google for something or you Bing for something and click the links, click the results, and find a solution to your problems. So I added some charts here that show you how much CPU we have to use for serving that amount of traffic. And it's usually around between 5 and 10%, as you can see. So we have space to support way more traffic than we already do in terms of CPU. And as you can tell, we serve around 600 requests per second per server. And when I say per server, this matters because this is how many servers we use. So Stack Overflow is a multi-tenant application, like I mentioned. It's also running on-prem on our own data center. And we do that using only 9 web servers. So in this case, those numbers are a little bit outdated, but we had 300 requests per second per server. And remember, we are running between 5 and 10% of CPU usage, which means there's a lot of room to improve. As far as our databases go, we also have a very lean on-prem data center setup. A very lean infrastructure setup. We use only 4 SQL servers. For Stack Overflow alone, the Stack Overflow website alone, we use 2. It's always one primary and one replica. So everything on Stack Overflow and everything on our infrastructure is redundant. Those servers are really beefy. We have 1.5 terabytes of RAM. But remember that together, those 4 servers run almost 1 billion SQL queries per day. So that's a lot of queries, and that's a lot of things that we serve in very lean infrastructure. And you might ask yourself how we do that. And we do that by prioritizing performance. We have a very optimized code base. We run on .NET since the very beginning. In fact, when we launched in 2008, we were already a NASDAQ MVC 1.0 application. But this talk is not exactly about Stack Overflow and its infrastructure and how we run it, but also about our migration to .NET 6, which is one of the initiatives that we ran this year. Before we go into the .NET 6 migration, however, I wanted to show you some interesting numbers from our previous migration, which happened in December 2020. And that was when we moved from .NET 3.1 to .NET 5. As you can tell, in terms of CPU, I didn't even include CPU here because we didn't really observe that big of an impact. But in terms of memory management, we had a lot of improvements in how the heap size is managed, but also the large object heap, generation 2 objects. As you can see down on the bottom of the page here, I have the Gen 2 charts. We observed a much better usage and much more efficient usage of memory just by upgrading from .NET 3.1 to .NET 5. We did not add more memory to those servers. We did not add more CPU. We did not change the servers. We just upgraded the version of .NET that we were using, and that alone helped improve our performance. And keep in mind, performance is very important for us. If we want to keep running that much traffic in such a lean infrastructure as the one that we currently have today, it is essential that we have performance as top of our minds every time that we are building or improving something in our applications. All right. Now let's fast forward from December 2020 and go to May 2022, when, fun fact, .NET 5 was about to get to end of life, and we always want to be running on LTS. And that's when we started working on migrating to .NET 6. But first, we had to migrate Entity Framework. We use Entity Framework in very specific parts of our code base for connecting with the database and running queries. And we were still using Entity Framework 2.2 before May 2022, before May this year, which is a very old version of Entity Framework. So we knew that in order to migrate to .NET 6, we would have to upgrade our version of Entity Framework first, which we did very easily. So the total number of line changes, if you're curious, was around 140 to the entire code base of Stack Overflow. Another thing that's important to mention here, Stack Overflow is not only multi-tenant and on-prem, it's also a monolithic application. So all those changes and all that traffic that you saw is hitting a single apple on IIS, and we can deploy it uniquely on those 9 web servers with a load balancer. But that's why we only had to update one application when we migrated from Entity Framework 2.2 to Entity Framework 5. The changes that we had to make were very punctual and very simple, actually. Change some methods, names that got changed over time, like from SQL to from SQL raw, some EF3 breaking changes that we had to adapt to. But actually, as we did not expect to have any performance impact of that migration. And that's because our code base is already highly optimized, as you could tell when I showed that we are only using 5% CPU and very efficient memory management as well. Once we had migrated to Entity Framework 5, which is supported on .NET 6, then we could start planning for our migration to .NET 6 itself from .NET 5. And a very important part of that migration was testing. We don't want to roll out such an impactful change to production without ensuring that it is working, that we haven't inadvertently broken anything. So we actually have around 15,000 automated tests that we run periodically, either periodically, nightly, or on every single deployment at Stack Overflow. And what we did was we created a new branch with all the changes for .NET 6. We published that branch with what we call a PR environment, which is something that allows us to test any changes before merging them to the main branch. And then we ran our test suite on top of that branch. So we were able to validate that all tests were passing before we merged the .NET 6 migration back to the main branch. Of course, that didn't happen as smoothly as it sounds. Some tests broke and we had to figure out what was going on, but it wasn't that hard and it wasn't that tricky at all. In the end, in May 12th, that's when we finally merged the .NET 6 upgrade. Once we could see that all the tests were executing and running successfully. Deployment was also interesting. So I added some numbers here regarding what it took to make that migration, right? The diff on Git of the number of line changes that we had to make was about adding 300 lines of code, removing 200. So as you can tell, it's a very small diff, meaning that migration was very smooth as well. But we didn't want to deploy that change across all of our 9 web servers at once. So we did what we always do when we do some big migration such as this. We deploy the changes to a single web server and we observe what happens, right? So we let it run for a day or two. We have some scheduled tasks and background tasks that only run at night. So we wanted to see if they would also run correctly and if we would have no issues. And once we were confident that those changes were working for everybody, then we could roll it out to all of our remaining 8 web servers. Now, let's see some numbers of what happened after we migrated to .NET 6. We saw a small improvement in heap size for sure. It was around between 5 and 10 gigabytes typically, and it dropped a little bit to under 5 gigabytes right after we migrated. Other than that, another noticeable change was the way that the threads and thread pools were behaving. And that's not surprising at all, because we know that one of the biggest areas of improvement on .NET 6 is around how thread pools work and how threads are managed by thread pools. So even though that didn't really mean that we had any performance direct impacts, it was also interesting to notice that some of the things that Microsoft had been advertising as, look, we changed a lot of things around thread pools, we could actually see that happen and how that changed the pattern of how threads are used in our application, in our monitoring tools. There are a lot of things that we can still do that we haven't yet that .NET 6 enables, like dynamic PGO. This is something that we can try out and see if it brings us any performance improvements, but we haven't yet. And if you want to see more details about how rolling out .NET 6 went, the kind of problems we faced, the specific breaking changes that we encountered, you can read a blog post by Wouter de Koord on his blog, which has the complete path from the entity framework upgrades all the way to the .NET 6 migration. Now, that's a short summary of what I wanted to share with you about the .NET 6 migration, but I know that John Galloway has some questions for me as well, and I'm happy to answer them. John?
Wow, that was incredible. That's really exciting. As I like that you called out the path as a developer before and after Stack Overflow and how it's changed my life as a developer. It's great to think about that. Gosh, okay, so one question I'm going to throw at you is, you talked about moving to .NET 6, and part of the deal with .NET Conf is we're announcing .NET 7, and so it kind of never ends. It's a continual thing. What's your overall strategy? How do you think about migrating between versions, and how do you build applications that are not hard to migrate between versions?
Well, the strategy that we usually have is, of course, we always want to be on LTS. We always want to be on a supported version of our vendors, and .NET is one of those. So the .NET 7 migration is actually already planned. We're waiting for it to come, and usually we always do the same path, right? We create a PR somewhere with the proposed changes, and we test them, and we see what breaks, and also we try to canary them on one of our servers to see if we see any improvements or any concerns. That's exactly how we did all of our migrations so far, and there were many of them. Like I said, we started with ASP.NET 1.0. We've been through .NET Framework. We've been through .NET Core 2.0, 3.1, 5, now 6. And as I said, we're already planning for 7. What is really impressive to observe is how much progress we can see from each of those migrations, not necessarily in terms of performance, but just the amount of things that become available to us, right? We know that Microsoft has been putting so much work into making their libraries and frameworks faster and more optimized. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we love, because it also helps us replace a lot of the things that we had built in-house, and we can now just use the new versions of the framework for it. A great example is Entity Framework. We built Dapper back in the day, a micro ORM, because we wanted to have more performance in how we connected to the database, hydrated objects, all of that. Entity Framework has evolved so much that we could start considering now replacing a lot of parts of our code base that are using Dapper with it, just because the performance is already very, very good and acceptable for us. So
that's great. So an interesting thing that I like about your presentation and overall strategy is when I talk to people about, migrating between versions, some of them get overwhelmed because they'll see all the new features and think that they need to use those in order to update. But it looks like what you're talking about is doing a very lightweight update and basically just get on the new version, and then that unlocks the ability to use the new features, but you don't have to use them in order to update. I guess that was more of a statement than a question, but so yeah.
No, but precisely, like another example of that is the routing system. Like the routing system on AspNet and controllers has been rewritten or refactored or improved over years. And we had written our own routing mechanism back in the day that we didn't need to replace right away, but we could, especially with .NET Core, which makes it's so pluggable. You can use, we can attach your dependencies in a way that's very flexible. So usually our main goal with the migration is let's just update the framework. Let's just put it out there, but doing as little code changes as possible just to make it run and to make it work. And then let's assess what are the new shiny things that we can start incorporating. And that's progress that happens over time, not immediate. Of course, like I mentioned, we always want to be on LTS. So for .NET 6, as if you were watching closely, we migrated on May 2022, which is when .NET 5 became end of life. So we actually delayed a little bit on that one. But usually we'd like to be like at least a couple of months in advance so that we don't risk going end of life in any case.
Cool. So you mentioned kind of a monolith architecture sort of setup. You do have some microservices internally, right? For things like, I don't know, search and tagging and that sort of stuff? Or
not really. No, we don't have microservices. Well, at least it really depends, because microservices is it's a tricky word to define, right? Yeah. Different authors have different definitions. We do have services, though. So there are some parts of the main code base that have been, over years, have been extracted and became isolated services, like emailing, for example. We have an email sending service. It's not part of the monolith. We just call their APIs, and that's it. There's others, but the main application, the Q&A site everybody uses and loves, that's a monolith. That's a 14 years old monolith that has been continuously improved. There are, however, of course, we use services for other things. Like we have our Kubernetes cluster that we use for powering the PR environments I mentioned. So every time that you want to have to spin up an environment on your PR for sales, support, PMs to test it without having to check out your code and run it locally, that's powered by containers and Kubernetes, but it's not microservices. It's just how we use those platforms and tooling that's usually associated with distributed systems. But Stack Overflow is a monolith, and it's deployed as a single package in over those 9 web servers that I mentioned.
Okay. So you mentioned using the kind of, like Kubernetes or whatever for internal services, right? And I noticed that a lot of, large companies will keep what works, keep the existing code base that's stable, but then use kind of the hot, shiny, interesting things for more internal, or, what I mean, behind the scenes. Do you have some things that you do? Like, for instance, I talk to some companies that use like Blazor for line of business things, or, that sort of, is that something that you do as well at Stack?
It is, absolutely. So I'll give you an example. We use Dapper, not Dapper, our open source library, but Dapper, Microsoft Dapper, DAPR, for some of our internal services that that our platform team is building for powering things that should be shared across all the company, right? We don't use that on Stack Overflow code base, however. So it's really interesting because then we get to experiment with the new shiny things and assess what is worth incorporating or what is worth adding to the main code base into the monolith or not. We try to have a very pragmatic approach to those things, however, right? So instead of asking, okay, this is new and shiny, should we experiment with it? We always try to ask the question, what problem are we trying to solve first, and whether or not our existing tooling and platforms can solve it. But I think that if you do not experiment with the new shiny, then you also hinder your ability to innovate and hinder your ability to incorporate new things that could actually make your life easier. I think that strategy of using internal services and tools for experimenting with new technology is absolutely a winner.
Cool. Okay, I think your story is really interesting because you worked as a developer at Stack for a while before moving up to director. What are your experiences in just kind of in general in working with .NET? Like, do you have any stories or thoughts on that as you've seen .NET kind of progress over the years?
Oh, yeah. I've been a .NET programmer since the beginning of my career as an engineer, honestly, since 2004. So I've seen a lot of change since I joined Stack Overflow, and I joined in 2014. So I've been there for almost 9 years now. I think when I joined, we were still on .NET Framework. Can't remember what specifically version of it because it's been a while. But for sure, I have seen a lot of progress and evolution over the years. Perhaps the biggest one has been .NET Core, indeed, right? The ability to run it cross-platform, the ability to make it run in containers as easily as we did for our PR environments, for example. That has been a game changer and an enabler of a lot of things. I'm what I would call a junior manager. I became a director of engineering in January, so it's going to be a year. But I am a software developer and software engineer at heart. It's great to be able to have a different kind of impact as a director, of course. But if you couldn't notice from my presentation, I'm still very much hands-on and in touch with our technical side of things.
Cool. So seeing that kind of perspective you have, both, having grown up with .NET and then also like now, managing and hiring and that sort of things. What sort of advice would you give to new .NET developers for looking at their career and, thinking about like someday applying to work at a company like Stack?
Well, usually the first advice that I give to new engineers, regardless of the stack that I choose, is pick one thing and go deep in it, right? So C#, .NET, ASP.NET Core perhaps, pick that, understand how web applications work, understand how ASP.NET Core abstractions work on top of how the web works, and then go deep on C#, understand, start small, of course, start with the basics, understanding of the language, and go deep, go into memory management, go into improve your expertise in terms of depth. And then you can think about breadth as well, right? But it is important to pick one thing and do it well. For Stack, one of the things that I always tell, of course, less experienced engineers or junior developers or people who are starting their careers is be as pragmatic as you can in terms of the technology that you pick, but also in terms of how you approach technology. I think that's one of our biggest advantages as a company is that we've always valued pragmatism over dogmatism. So when we pick a technology, when we pick an approach, when we pick a migration such as this, we have a reason why we're doing it, and everybody understands the reasons. It's not just because everybody's doing microservices now, so we should as well. That's not a good reason to go into microservices, but it's also not a good reason not to. So if tomorrow we find out that we actually want to split Stack Overflow into a lot of small services because that allows our organization to scale better, we can do that too. We're not locked down into any of the approaches. That's what pragmatism is all about. And this has nothing to do with experience. It's more about how you handle the problems that you are given as an engineer. So it's the kind of thing that I would highly encourage even less experienced engineers to start practicing as they learn new technologies and as they start coding new programs as well.
Cool. Okay, so you mentioned the dogmatism, pragmatism kind of balance, and one thing that always, reminds me of is testing. There are very different approaches to testing. It's obviously a very practical tool, the way you're using it to handle your migrations. It's also something where people get pretty dogmatic. What are some general kind of testing philosophies and implementation at Stack?
It's very funny that you mentioned testing because, fun fact. Up until perhaps 5 years ago, we didn't really do any automated testing. And the reason why we didn't do any automated testing is because we didn't have a private site like we have now with the Stack Overflow for Teams, which is private Q&A, and all of our products were publicly available. And guess what? If you ship a bug to Stack Overflow, you hear about it on Twitter in 5 minutes. So the feedback cycle that we got from testing, we got much faster from our community even, and it was okay to fix it forward. That changes when you have paying customers and SLAs, and that's when we started to really invest in automated testing. I mentioned we have around 15,000 tests right now. The vast majority of those tests are actually integration tests, which mean they run deeply on the cores of our code base, and they actually test our queries. They actually test our interaction with our infrastructure and systems and dependencies, but they're also slow. So we need to balance running them all the time versus how much time does it take for them to run, which is something that we're still working on, right? Finding the right balance for it. But as somebody who has had bugs caught by tests and preventing outages in the past, I am a strong believer that they make our lives better. And the more tests and the more confident you are in your test suite, of course, the easier it is to introduce new changes.
Cool. So one fascinating thing for me, you talked about the huge numbers of questions and all the interactions and stuff, and that's a huge amount of data. So you're running on just a few. So you've got SQL Server and you've got Redis. And I'm thinking there's got to be some kind of fascinating like data structure and data management challenges you've got there, right? In terms of availability versus managing all this historical data going back for 15 years and all that. So I don't know. How do you think more about like data and the data management stuff?
That's a really nice question. Yes, so our Stack Overflow database, which by the way is public, you can download. We publish data dumps every 6 months. If you have 4.5 terabytes of data available somewhere, you can download the entire Stack Overflow database. And notice that I mentioned 4.5 terabytes of data, and our SQL Server has 1.5 terabytes of RAM, meaning a third of our data can actually be found in memory. And that makes querying them much more efficient. They're also using SSD as hard storage, but which is also much better and makes it much more efficient. But on top of SQL, the only thing we have for search on Stack Overflow is we use Elasticsearch for indexing our data. In case you ever use our in-app search mechanism, that's where you're hitting. But people are usually surprised when I tell them that the question page, which is our hottest path, the one that renders in 24 average milliseconds, is not cached at all. So that page, every time that you open it, it runs 4 different SQL queries for rendering 4 different parts of it. And each one of those queries need to run in under 0.1 milliseconds. That's like the hard limit that we have for that page so that we do not degrade performance. So we invest a lot of knowledge and time into ensuring that our databases are as fast as they can be. We have an amazing team of DBREs who take care of our baby SQL servers. And it's honestly a lot of experimentation. Run it, find bottlenecks, remove the bottlenecks, do it again. That's how we got to the state where we are today. We used to cache that page, and then we realized that we had a lot of cache misses instead of hits. And caching was actually just making code more complex. So we removed caching, we made everything simpler and faster.
Wow, that's awesome. I've got 1,000 more questions I'd like to ask, but we're pretty much at time. So I really appreciate this. I'll turn it back over to you to wrap up. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, John. And thank you, everybody, for having me. I hope you enjoyed it and enjoy .NET Conf. There's a lot of great stuff coming.